Today let's take a look at the Golden Armoured Legion of the Emperor himself, and talk through the Adeptus Custodes army in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Custodes and how to get the most out of the Codex in the current edition of Warhammer. We'll talk about how they've been getting on with respect to other armies, look over their core rules and some of the strongest rules from each of the sections in the Codex, look at their shield hosts, touch on every one of their units, have a few thoughts about allies, and then finish up with a competitive army list. Loads to be talking about, so let's power up the Guardian Spears and get going. So currently I'd argue that Adeptus Custodes are a solid enough mid-tier faction in 40k. They've not been doing too badly throughout basically all of 9th edition, their prior codex had plenty of good stuff, and then they were initially very strong when they got their new book out in early 2022, got a near immediate points buff, but then Games Workshop released some even stronger codexes than Custodes and nerfed a few key rules, including things like Obsec and making some of their stratagems once per game, and now overall rate them as a bit of a mid-tier army. They can certainly challenge some of the strongest armies in the game and have a far easier time of it compared with some of the weakest factions in 40k. Tournament stats wise, in the Nephilim era they appear to have a 51% win percentage, really quite solid, but maybe they're one of the armies that perhaps struggles in the absolute highest tier of play, only having the one tournament win in Nephilim, but a fair few podium finishes to back that up. I'd say maybe they're generally an army that's reasonably easy to use, hard to go too far wrong with a lot of chunky boys with objectives secured, but perhaps are generally a little bit better at bullying factions that are the same or weaker than them, and they're a bit more manageable with the top list in the hands of the best players. Perhaps fairly easy to use, but maybe a slightly low skill ceiling for when you've mastered the army perhaps. In general though, despite the nerfs, they're far from bad. They certainly have some good things going for them. The models are super elite with 2+ saves everywhere, 4+ invuls, and quality melee and ranged attacks hitting on 2s. I think it's particularly interesting that they've got some very nice stats characters, such as Shield Captains and Trajan Valoris, and the Martial Cathars I think are a real asset to the army. It means that you can almost do a little bit of tailoring depending on the matchup, and basically picking your favourite 5 out of 12 buffs to combat the enemy. In terms of weaknesses, I'd say that they do rely a fair bit too much on damage 2 weapons. It'll give them a good matchup against some armies, particularly various flavours of Space Marines, but it means that they can really struggle against some others, like Death Guard with -1 damage all over the place. That can make that matchup pretty rough for the Custodes. They are very hyper elite as well, you get lots of quality but not very many models. It means they can't screen things particularly well, and the loss of every single model hurts. You might also be dedicating big chunky units to doing slightly more menial tasks, or having to hunt down very light enemy infantry units that perhaps isn't quite worth their time. Just in general for the army as well, I feel they're a bit reliant on Forge World units. This might not help collectors in the real world all that much, as they're a bit pricey to get a hold of, though at least the core Games Workshop plastic range is a very cheap army. Outside of Forge World they don't really have a lot of options for longer range firepower. Overall though, certainly solid enough, definitely a lot worse off than when they were stomping tournaments early in January, but powerful enough to put on the board and do well. Getting into the army's core rules, I will start with a bunch of things that are common across quite a lot of the army. Generally their impressive stat lines I think are worth mentioning. Hitting on 2s is really quite nice for being resistant to modifiers, but can mean things like can't hit on more than a 4+ for light Harlequins or something, can be annoying. They've got decent enough defense with toughness 5 and 2+ saves and 3 wounds. It means that they'll be able to shrug off most small arms, but some things really can mess them up quite badly, particularly anything that's say AP -2 and 3 damage. Say maybe Armiger Helverin autocannons perhaps, with the 2+ saves, light cover will be particularly relevant to them, pushing that save even higher. Otherwise they've got Aegis of the Emperor throughout the army, a 4+ invul and a 6+ save against mortal wounds. The invul's very nice against things like Melter and stuff, and the 6+ shrug off is very nice indeed. It helps stop mortal wounds from absolutely ruining the army, though in general with their high points cost they're still quite efficient to point at Custodes units. Obviously a 6+ save will only shrug off a mortal wound 1/6 of the time. Otherwise they have a couple of rules to show that their troops are bigger and better than most units. A rule that in the Codex is definitely not called the Emperor's Chunky Golden Boys. Previously all infantry got Obsec, but now it's just the troops, but across the army, even out of the troops, all models count as 2 models for the purposes of objectives, and that does help compensate a little bit for low numbers and just getting mobbed by hordes and things. It won't always make the difference, but it could be helpful say for a unit of 3 of them not having an objective stolen by 5 light enemy troops. As well as that, Adeptus Custodes infantry count as double the models for lookout sir purposes as well, meaning that 2 models will usually be able to count for Lookout Sir on characters. Again, that's pretty helpful, as otherwise those small squads would stop protecting characters as soon as they took 1 casualty. Finally, on the other half of the Talons of the Emperor, the Sisters of Silence get the Daughter of the Abyss rule. The infantry models get this one, an 18-inch debuff of -1 to cast that can stack up to a -3. Very nice to have somewhere in the front ranks if you are facing Grey Knights or Thousand Sons. The units can't be the target of psychic powers, which could give them the option for basically being deployed at the front and just turning off Smite for a section of your army for a turn. Smite has to target the closest unit, and these can't be affected, so it basically just doesn't work. They also get a +1 to wound against Psykers and Demons, which I guess could be helpful in given matchups, but in general they don't tend to be the most efficient damage dealers anyway. They do also have that rule as well, which means that you can't take more Sisters of Silence than you have Custodes core units in the army, unless you're choosing to run entire Anathema Psychana detachments. In general, it still seems that the army's focus is mainly on the Custodes themselves, and the Sisters units are in slightly more niche roles. The other great big rule that the Custodes get is their pure faction ability, the Martial Qatar, a system of turn-by-turn boosts, which you can basically organise pre-game to try and counter the enemy. The rules for this are maybe just a little bit obtuse, but simple enough once you get the hang of them. You get to choose 3 buffs out of a list of 6 and put them in order at the start of the game. On turn 1, you pick the first of your 3, and then for the actual turn you get to pick either the first or second stance of that Qatar to go into on that turn. Then on the second turn, you can either use the stance that you haven't used, or move on to the next one, and you're not able to go back to the first after you've discarded it. You keep on going like that, basically you're able to use either one or both of the Qatar stances, and then progress to the next. Not sure if that's the clearest explanation, but for example you could have, say, the Rendax Qatar, use stance 2 of it on turn 1, then go to stance 1 of it on the next turn, then move on to the one that you've ranked second, say Salvus for example, just decide to use stance 2 of that one, and then turn 4 go on to the last one that you've ranked, and then use both of the stances over the last 2 turns. I think it could lead to a little bit of decision paralysis for which way you rank them, but it basically rewards you for getting the buffs that you need right at the right time of the game. In terms of the actual martial Qatars themselves, here are the list. Each shield host also has a Qatar of its own where you get both of the stances on one given turn, so it makes that one super important for them. Just going through the list quickly, I think Callistus is okay to have early on. You can advance an extra d6 to get a bit further forward, and shoot as if stationary despite advancing as well. That could be particularly nice, so you get a little bit of Guardian Spear fire or something, despite moving your army forward quickly. Conservi is an action one. You get to do actions when advancing or falling back, or shooting when doing actions. That one in particular could be very nice for raising banners and things. Again, could be an interesting early game one perhaps. You could have a bunch of units advance up and plant banners on midfield objectives right from turn 1. Decaterai is a bit of an anti-horde one. The second stance is very relevant if you're fighting an army with mainly 1 wound infantry. It means that you can get an extra attack and make your attacks damage 1. It's not going to be worth it against anything that's got more than 1 wound, but if say you're fighting orcs or Sisters of Battle or something, then that one's going to give most of your army a flat melee buff, maybe a reasonable one to have mid to late game. Rendax is the one that you want to have for fighting vehicles and monsters. Stance 1 is really quite an awesome damage buff against them, 6s to hit auto wound vehicles both at range and melee, and say if you're playing Imperial or Chaos Knights then that's really quite a good leg up. It even applies to things like Guardian Spear shooting and stuff, which can be surprisingly savage against the toughest vehicles around if you are punching through a fair few auto wounds. The other one's a +1 strength boost in combat against them. I feel like maybe that one's a little bit more situational. The first one's the good one I think. You just have to see whether or not it's likely that any combats would happen where the strength would make a difference when you're deciding whether or not to take or skip the second part. Captaris is quite a nice melee manipulation one. Both bits of it are powerful if you think you're going to be involved in some crucial combats, or if you think that you're going to be piling forward and tying up the enemy. The first one means that you can't re-roll hit rolls against your units. That one's okay, and is a bit matchup dependent maybe, but I think that the second bit is really quite interesting. You get to roll off when your opponent tries to fall back, and if you win then they just simply can't. It doesn't apply to monsters and vehicles, and fly units get +1 to their roll, but at least theoretically that could be pretty game changing for certain units. Say for example you charge something and then kill it and pile into something else. If that something else was a ranged unit that really wanted to be falling back and shooting you, then stopping them from doing so is pretty brutal. You'd keep your own unit safe from shooting, and then potentially even kill their ranged unit in the enemy turn. The second part of that just seems particularly good against any armies with a bunch of shooting. Finally we've got Salvus, which is again useful. The plus 4-inch range to guns could be helpful if you're at an annoying range where you've got limited targets, but I feel like the second part is another very nice damage buff. If infantry units don't advance, they can shoot twice with any auric weapons. It's going to be a big deal if you're taking rather a lot of custodian guard with the standard guardian spears and things. If you're going for a fairly troops heavy army, that could be a turn where you get a lot more dead enemy models. Overall, they're a fairly strong set of rules. I'd maybe consider Callistus or Conservi for an early one depending on your game plan. And then the choice of the others really depends on what sort of units you have and what sort of things you're fighting and whether or not it's going to be enough of a difference. Some things seem pretty auto-include, like say Rendax against Imperial Knights, or perhaps Salvos if you've got an awful load of Guardian Spears, and getting twice the shots is actually going to be pretty big. Moving on, let's take a look through the other rule sections of the Codex and talk about some of the strongest picks. In terms of Warlord Traits, Custodes can buy them in for 1 CP, and also stack 2 different Warlord Traits on one model if they're willing to pay an extra one. I think Trajan Valoris is a pretty tempting choice to be the Warlord though. He gets 2 Warlord Traits for 1 command point. If you have him as the Warlord, then he gains you a command point, negating out the cost, and allows a bit of command farming, longer heroic interventions, reroll hit rolls for him, and rearranging the Katars. Quite a lot for basically free beyond his points cost. Otherwise, I'd say the other really standout Warlord trait is Superior Creation. That one gives you a 5+ Feel No Pain, so a solid all-round defensive boost, including against mortal wounds. That one's particularly popular to make the biker captains more durable, who are already kind of hard to take out. If you did want to stack 2 traits on 1 captain, you could maybe even add that to Radiant Mantle as well for a -1 to hit. That just doubles down on making them hard to kill. Otherwise, Master of Martial Strategy doesn't seem terrible, regenerating CP on a 5+ each time you spend a stratagem. On something safe like a Vexilla, that could stay safe for a chunk of the game. Lock Warden I think is an interesting one for the Shadow Keepers to allow a character to ignore invuls, and for the Sisters of Silence I think Oblivion Knight is actually okay. That one gives the character a 3-inch aura of cancelling enemy obsec, which if you combine that with some sturdy custodian troops on objectives, will basically guarantee you control of that objective unless you can kill the troops and this model. The Custodes relics I'd say aren't enormously standout. I'd say by far the best is probably the Castellan's Mark. This one is one that allows you to redeploy 2 units or put them into strategic reserve. Quite a big deal on Custodes units. They're usually quite big and valuable, so if you get the option to get a good alpha strike or hide them safe from enemy shooting when they get turn 1, then it could potentially be quite a big swing in the game. Otherwise, perhaps the other standout one is the Praetorian Plate. Gives you a little bit of extra toughness, but mainly gives you your Terminator once per game heroic intervention anywhere on the board that's within 3 inches of your units. Potentially could be a way to swing a combat if the opponent thinks that they're going to win a combat against one of your standard troops, and then all of a sudden they've got yet another fighty shield captain to deal with, and that might be the tipping point. Otherwise, I think that a fair few of the shield host relics are usable, say the Dread Host Axe or the Stasis Oubliette for the Shadow Keepers. For making characters yet more dangerous, there's a few Captain Commander traits. These ones are the points cost upgrades to make a shield captain a little bit better, and there's different ones depending on which flavour of shield captain you're fielding. Again, I feel like there's another standout best one here, Tip of the Spear for 15 points for the Dawn Eagle Jetbike captain. When you're charging or making heroic interventions, that gives you reroll 1s to hit and to wound, effectively over a 33% buff to your melee damage, which isn't too bad at all on something like an 160 point model. I'd say this one's basically a no-brainer include if you are taking the popular Dawn Eagle captain. Otherwise, the rest I think are largely usable, but nowhere near as efficient as that one. Unstoppable Destroyer is only 10 points for the Terminator captain. That gives you 4-inch pile-ins and consolidations, and you can go in any direction provided you still wind up in melee. That can allow some gamey shenanigans, maybe hitting one unit in combat and then consolidating into something else, maybe robbing the opponent of the chance to fight back. Inspirational Exemplar is also pretty interesting, 15 points for the standard shield captain. That gives him a 9-inch reroll aura of 1s to hit. Not at all bad if you've got a foot-slogging captain moving up the board. It means that a fair few more units will get in range of that damage buff. In Warzone Nephilim, the unique secondary objectives are a bit more important than usual. A couple of the Custodes ones are okay, but they're certainly not standout good compared with other factions, I think. I'd say probably the most overall useful one is Stand Vigil, though it is a massive swing on whether or not you go first or second, making it a bit of a risky fallback pick. You need to try and control more midfield objectives than your opponent does at the end of the battle round, and this makes it massively easy to do if you're going second. But if you're going first, it means that your opponent will have the chance to clear your unit off them before it's scored, meaning that in most games that are pretty close, you're unlikely to get too much from this. Overall, if you're willing to gamble, it isn't really the worst, but I must admit it's not the best designed secondary in my opinion, with this much of a swing as to whether or not you get first turn. The Auric Mortalis one is another bit of a gamble one, but a usable one I'd say. The game is that you nominate either a Supreme Commander or Primarch, or the single most expensive unit in the enemy army. You get 5 points if you've killed it by the end of the game, a bonus 5 if you killed it in melee, and then a bonus 5 if you've done the previous 2, and you also slew it in melee outside your deployment zone. Obviously this one is massively swingy, it's often going to be 15 points or 0. I think it just kind of depends on what your opponent's strongest unit is. Are they going to be forced to play with it aggressively, and if they are, do you think that you will realistically kill it by the end of the game? Sometimes the answers to all of those things will probably be yes. If it's something expensive that the opponent basically has to rush up the board to try and get the most value out of it, and you're able to mob it with a whole load of melee or something, then all is well and good. But it maybe does feel a bit risky with the opponent having the ability to play cagey with that one unit, give it a very good chance to survive the game while also dealing at least some damage, and you might well be left with 0 points. Still though, I think this one is usable. Finally though, Might of Terror is kind of awful. It's one where you have to kill enemy units while you don't lose any yourself. Even for Adeptus Custodes, I think you're likely to take some casualties in most battle rounds. It just seems unlikely that in most balanced games you'd really score this more than once or twice. Overall though, I think generally Custodes are going to be quite reliable on the book objectives, and Stand Vigil is an interesting enough one if you are stuck. It just means that you might be gaining or losing something like 6 victory points based on nothing more than the first turn roll. Moving on to stratagems, and though the Custodes have had a fair few tones down, there are quite a lot of generic interesting ones that are going to apply to a lot of units. Running through them quickly, we've got 1 or 2 CP for Arcane Genetic Alchemy, their transhuman rule that you can use on infantry. Pretty nice if you really want a unit to survive and it's about to get focused by heavy guns. Slayer of Nightmares again is 1 or 2 CP depending on squad size, plus 1 to wound against a unit with a higher toughness than you. Really good if you're fighting something like Imperial Knights perhaps. Characters can fight on death for 2 CP, always handy when you've got scary things like Trajan Valoris or the bike shield captains going around. The whole army gets to heroic intervene at 6 inches. This means that enemies need to stay back from Custodes at all times if they can't afford to be in combat, and it does make them a bit more intimidating to muscle off objectives. For 1 or 2 CP, Martial Discretion is now once per game. This one is the ability to trade out 1 Martial Qatar stance for another. Really quite a powerful and flexible boost, but you're going to have to try and target it to the point in the game where it's going to have the most effect. Potentially interesting ones could be for doing an action after advancing, or shooting while doing an action. If you need that action done, then both of those could be great. You could use it to turn off hit rerolls against something like a unit buffed with Chapter Master rerolls. You could use it to stop enemies from falling back with the Captaris one perhaps, or give you a boost against monsters and vehicles with Rendax. Lots of solid options there, always one to be keeping in mind. Indomitable Guardians is 1 CP to interrupt when you're on an objective. Really nice to get that rather than the 2 CP that it costs most factions. Again, makes Custodes troops on objectives just that little bit more intimidating. For 1 or 2 CP, there's the Emperor's Auspice, now once per game for infantry only. And again, this is another way to turn off enemy rerolls. You can't reroll hits or wounds or damage when making the attack against this unit. Loads of factions are pretty reliant on those. Could be quite a fun way just to say no to Lightning Claws once, or turn off the full rerolls from a big commander like Abaddon or Varl. Empiric Severance is one to be aware of for the Sisters of Silence, a 4+ chance to auto-deny power within 18 inches. Pretty big on something meaningful that's going to bucket out a bunch of mortal wounds, or get the opponent some key mobility or something. And finally, a super problematic one for enemies charging you is the Tanglefoot Grenade. Target a non-fly unit within 12 inches of one of your infantry units, and they get a -d6 movement or charge. If your opponent's trying to make a 7-inch or longer charge, this could potentially make it undoable if you get lucky, and even just having a small chance to basically turn off a charge is pretty big, likely to be saving you multiple models. Very nasty on any units coming out of Deep Strike. Overall, really quite a lot of solid options. Most Custodes lists should at least have a reasonable amount of CP to play with. Lots of lists include Valoris for a bit of command point farming, and you can fit just about every Custodes army within a single battalion if you want to, so you're not going to lose many on detachments. Shield hosts next, and it seems that in Nephilim the Emperor's Chosen are remaining the strongest and most overall played shield host. It seems that well over half of Custodes tournament players seem to use them. They get their 4+ save against mortal wounds, which admittedly are kind of everywhere, and that's really big to have. Each unit gets a single reroll, which is quite nice on things like salvo launchers, but pretty good on just about any of the Custodes' quality shots or melee hits, so a nice general damage boost there. 1 CP for their stratagem Esteemed Amalgam is almost certainly going to come in handy over the course of the game. Games Workshop did nerf this one, so now it can only be used once, but you basically get to pick a different shield host's fighting style for the turn and use that one instead. Perhaps some of the most interesting units are allowing a unit to fall back and charge and get into combat with something else. Or maybe if you just want some big damage against one tough model, you could use the reroll wound rolls against characters from Shadowkeepers. Loads of other options though, there might be some other good situational stuff. Finally, I think it's interesting that they can get the Rendax Catar twice, so against things like Imperial Knights and things, you'll be able to get those auto wounds on 6s for a couple of turns in a row. Not going to be helpful against every army, but if you're playing monsters or vehicles, then it's great. After these guys, the next 3 that I'd rank are the Emissaries Imperatus, Shadowkeepers, and perhaps the Dread Host as well. All of those do have interesting other buffs for the Custodes if you're not taking the Emperor's Chosen. The Emissaries get to ignore modifiers, which are quite common throughout 40k. They get to fight first and have a very nice pre-game move stratagem, basically guaranteeing you a charge with bikes if you want it, if you're willing to spend the CP. Shadowkeepers get to debuff enemy melee, so are quite good against combat armies. They get to reroll wound rolls against characters, both at range and in melee. That can be quite big with trying to take down some big nasties like Lord's Discordants, Demon Princes, or Knight characters. And then both their unique Warlord Trait and Relic are both good. Lock Warden gets to ignore invul saves, always good when you're trying to take down elite units, and Stasis Oubliette means that a enemy unit fights last in combat, again very useful for controlling the flow of combat on the front lines. They do have the double use of Captaris Catar as well, so that could be good for keeping some enemies in combat in multiple turns. Again, probably on a similar sort of level to those, though I wrote it a little bit lower here, was the Dread Host. I still think that they're very interesting indeed. Reroll charges is great with so much quality melee and would save your CP. You get better AP in melee, always good when Armour of Contempt Terminators are about, and they can make a rather fighty Custodes captain on foot, giving them that Ad Bonum Mortis damage 3 axe. Otherwise, I'd probably rate the Aquilon Shield and Solar Watch lower. Aquilon Shield gets Heroic Intervention, though you can do that anyway on just about any unit for 1 CP, and ignores AP -1, which matters on some armies, but not at all on others. They do have a -1 to wound shield relic, which makes the normal shield captain a bit more interesting, and you can double up on Salvus Catar if you do have loads of Guardian Spears. Finally, there's the Solar Watch with +1 to advance and charge, quite a nice general movement buff there, and it's pretty handy for units coming out from Golden Light as well. They can fall back and charge as well, and there's a Warlord trait that can allow infantry to advance and charge too. Could be handy enough for a bit more of a mobile battle line with a longer charge threat range. Still far from completely useless, though I'd probably rate it lower than the top 4. Overall, as I said, I'd still probably rate the Emperor's Chosen as the strongest overall, but I'd still say that a lot of the others remain very, very usable. Moving on, let's talk through each of the units in the Codex and in Forge World. I feel like for Custodes, it would be a mistake to leave out Forge World units, seeing as it makes up basically half of their game legal roster. For Infantry and Bike units, at least in terms of optimised picks, I'd say that the Custodian Guard, Sagittarium Custodians, and the Virtus Praetors outshine the rest. All of those are really quite efficient. The Custodian Guard are your standard troops choices. I'd say I'd be a bit more tempted to arm them with lots of spears than the shields, though I think that both are usable. I think Custodians are one of the armies where you really could just run lots and lots of troops and little else. Having lots of tough obsec bodies on the objectives works well. Against the right targets, even the auric weapons can pack a fair punch at range, and they're very good in melee with a bunch of high strength, AP -3 and damage 2 attacks. Really quite nice for thundering up the board alongside a few choice characters, taking those objectives, maybe doing actions and things before getting stuck into the foe. On the flip side, for a more ranged approach, and I actually think really quite balanced compared with the standard Custodian Guard, are the Forge World Sagittarium Custodians. They're basically the ranged Custodians with the heavy bolter profile and the damage 3 combi weapon. They seem pretty reasonable to have as a bit more of a backline option compared with the standard Custodes, though even they aren't particularly useless in melee either. They do still get a bunch of mid-strength combat attacks with the Misericordias. Again, they are so strong that you could potentially span out an entire army worth of them, and some people do. I think I might be a bit more tempted to have Custodian Guard going for the midfield objectives, and these guys holding the backfield ones. Lastly, for my favourite picks are the Virtus Praetors. Excellent and brutally powerful bikes that bring some much needed movement to the army with their big 14-inch range. They're tough to take out with a bunch of wounds and toughness 6, can put out some actual genuine anti-tank fire with the salvo launchers, and work quite well with rerolls or the Emperor's Chosen with those, and then charge them into combat where they get a bunch of high strength AP-3 damage 2 hits with +1 to wound from those Interceptor Lances. They're really quite commonly taken in game, maybe advancing alongside a Shield Captain on Jetbike, generally a very solid unit for any buffs or synergies that you can use with them. Running through the other choices that I maybe don't think are quite as strong, Wardens I think actually compete very well with the troops on raw numbers. They get the Feel No Pain and the extra attack with the option of the Castellan Axes, but really I think their stat line just isn't really quite enough impressive to be able to take them over the troops and lose the objective secured. I think they just have to be a bit cheaper or get the Obsec back if they really wanted to compete well again. They did have their bodyguard rule toned down in the balanced data slate. Alaris Terminators seem like they're in a very similar bag to the Wardens. Again, a stat line that competes okay. They do get free deep strike and a couple of interesting stratagem options, and they do have those grenade launchers. Again though, no grenade launcher and not filling troop slots just puts them inferior in my mind. Again, I think the Games Workshop could either give them their objective secured back or make them a bit cheaper. Either one of them could be good for making them relevant. As the alternative Forge World Terminators, the Aquilon Terminators have some other interesting options both at range and melee. Their gauntlets can make them strength 10, which is quite powerful, but I would say probably the Alaris Terminators, now they went down in points, are just a bit better than them for the cost. The Games Workshop Terminators maybe aren't quite as hard hitting, but the cheaper price I think makes them more worth it. In the troops, the Forge World have the option of the Custodes with the Adrasite and Pyrothite Spears, basically special weapon upgrades for the Guardian Spears, though I think that they're overcosted. I wouldn't take them compared with the Guard or the Sagittarium at the moment. The Venatari Custodians are the one with the jump packs, and I feel like they're a fair bit more playable. Fast jump pack guys with some okay close range shooting and a light bit of melee. You do have to basically make the choice whether or not you want to retain the 2+ save or to have damage 2 melee, so that is a bit of a trade-off with them there. Still though, fast moving infantry is interesting. I would say in general that they're probably not quite as all-round strong as the Virtus Praetors at the moment though, for perhaps the same role. Finally, we've got the Forge World Bikes, the Agamatus Custodians. Unfortunately, compared with Virtus Praetors, these just seem very badly balanced, costing more and often doing less. I'd take the Virtus Praetors at the moment all the time over these. Next up, we've got Dreadnoughts and Vehicles. Perhaps the standout in this section are all 3 patterns of Contemptor Dreadnought that the Custodes can get. Every single one of them I think is very efficient, and if you want to make one of the Forge World Dreadnoughts a bit more punchy in melee, you could take Eternal Penitent for extra attacks and boost charges. You can potentially go quite heavy on these in a list if you want to, but even just 1 or 2 seems pretty solid too. The Contemptor Achilles is the one with the great big Dread Spear. That one gets D3+3 damage in melee plus a bit of shooting. I think both the Storm Bolters and the Projectors are interesting enough secondary weapons too. The Contemptor Galatus is the one with the Warblade and the Shield. That one gets a good invul save at range and also is harder to kill in combat too. A bit less damage but a bit tougher and still all round very good. And then the standard Venerable Dreadnought from the Codex I think is also interesting as well. That one's a bit more of a budget option, it does cost less. The Multi-Melter's alright and it still has some okay melee. Not a lot behind the Forge World options point for point. I still rate the Forge World ones just a bit higher, but in some lists that are a bit strapped for points it might be the right choice. Otherwise, for the standout strong vehicles, I really quite like the Caladius Grav Tank. This one's fast, mobile and generalist firepower, pinging out a bunch of damage against units that the Custodians might struggle to reach. It does seem to complement the hardy Custodians quite well, maybe dealing with light infantry at range or light vehicles. The damage output isn't super strong, but it's fast, long range and flexible, meaning that you should be able to put that damage exactly where it's needed. Otherwise, out of the rest of the options, I feel like maybe the single next strongest might be the Telemon Heavy Dreadnought. A really solid, cool looking and reasonable anchor to a list. It gets the toughness 8, 2+ save and a feel no pain. I'd probably just stomp it up the middle and encourage opponents to try and deal as much damage to it as possible, and hopefully the rest of the list gets off a bit lightly. Useful enough, though in terms of its own damage dealing it's not super strong on the point per point basis. The Palace Grav attacks I think are alright. They're cheap 95 point skimmers with the Blaze Cannon. Maybe kind of compete with the Caladius for a role. I don't think that they're quite as efficient in terms of damage or defense as the Caladius, but they could be a bit more of an expendable threat to put on objectives and things. Otherwise, the Coronis Grav Carrier is the Caladius's cousin, a fast but expensive transport that does have its own firepower. It's generally just considered that transports just aren't very necessary for Custodia's list, and it seems like you're better off with more bodies on the ground, just foot slogging to where they need to go. I don't think it's awful, and it's not a million miles behind the Caladius in terms of firepower, but in general the consensus seems to be more custodians on foot backed up by the tanks, rather than having the tanks try and transport them. The Venerable Land Raider maybe is in a similar sort of place to that. Usual Land Raider issues as well, with wanting to go towards the enemy but then not actually wind up in combat to have its guns locked up. The Custodes one in particular does like having a 2+ ballistic skill, but will be very jealous of Armour of Contempt that the other Land Raiders have picked up. Finally, we've got the Ares and Orion Flyers, both really quite pricey, though have some alright guns. I'd be a lot more tempted by the gunship than the dropship one. At least that one gets some nice bombs and some more general purpose guns, but still I think they're a bit questionable for how many points they cost. Next up, we'll get to the Sisters of Silence in a second, but we have the Custodes characters first. Currently it seems that by far the strongest choices, and are running a lot of competitive lists, are Trajan Valoris and the Shield Captain on the Dawn Eagle jetbike. Mr. Trajan went up loads of points, he was 160 and now he's 200, but he still seems to be very worth it for what he does. He's just a really solid all-rounder with great melee damage, good survivability, and moment shackle tricks. He gets a 5+ feel no pain to make sure he's extra hard to take down. On top of that, he's got multiple Warlord traits and bonus command points as we mentioned, plus better buffing rules for nearby Custodes units, pretty handy to have in the centre of an advancing Custodian Guard battle line. A pretty reasonable pickup in most lists, I think. Otherwise, the Shield Captain on the jetbike is fast, tough, and dangerous at range and in melee. Having such a powerful character move quite so quickly and being hard to remove in its own right is a really good combo. I'd pick up Tip of the Spear for reroll ones to hit and wound, the Superior Creation trait for a 5+ feel no pain, and perhaps a salvo launcher to put down a bit more hurt on tanks. Kind of hard to go too far wrong with, but you would have to use it a little bit carefully. They're tough but certainly not unkillable. Otherwise, for other solid choices, if you weren't taking the jetbike captain, you could think about the Terminator one. The Presidium plate for the heroic intervention is pretty nice, and maybe an unstoppable destroyer for those big consolidates. He does have the option for deep strike if you want it. The Vexillus Praetors aren't too bad. They give you an aura of light cover or dense cover to make the Custodes a bit tougher as they slog up. Fairly simple and effective, can be another interesting place to bear useful relics, say for example the Castellan's Mark. Otherwise the Blade Champion I think is pretty usable as well. He doesn't give you the reroll buffs, but is really quite a fighty character for fairly cheap. The 3 different blade stances that he gets means that he's going to be generally useful against whatever he touches. He just maybe isn't super duper necessary for an army, as he doesn't really add too much besides his melee might. Finally, and a bit overshadowed on the Custodes character side, are the standard Shield Captains on foot. I think they're okay, maybe with that big reroll aura. They just seem less interesting than either the Jetbike one or the Terminator one to me, with the other options that they can take. Valerian as well, I think falls into a similar bag. If you were taking a foot Shield Captain, then his buffs aren't terrible. He gets permanent transhuman and a single reroll with his laurels each turn, but he doesn't get his own choice of relics and warlord traits, is less good than Trajan Valoris as a special character, and competes with the other captains within the same detachment, as he is a shield captain and he can only take 1 per detachment. Overall, hard to go wrong with Trajan or the jetbike captain, though I think just about everything else is usable, just perhaps not always optimal in every list. Next up, we've got the Sisters of Silence, almost a little mini codex within a codex, and they can provide the Custodes with a few cheap infantry and potentially some anti-psyker tricks. They've got 6 datasheets within the codex, and out of them I feel like the best choices are probably the Prosecutors and the Knight Centura, basically just doubling down on being cheap units and providing that psychic debuff. The Prosecutors are the cheap troops with bolters for 60 points, quite a nice unit just to be sitting around doing actions and holding objectives rather than dedicating menial tasks to Custodes that want to get stuck into the fray. And then against armies with a whole ton of psychic, like say Thousand Sons, Grey Knights or Tzeentch Demons, you could maybe have them act a bit more aggressively, maybe be towards the front rank of the army to provide the -1 to cast. Perhaps screen out any smites by having them try and hit this unit so they just go away, and maybe use that stratagem for a 4+ chance to turn off a psychic power. You probably don't want too many of them, but a single unit in a Custodes army I think is rarely going to be the worst choice. Otherwise, another option for the similar thing would be the Knight Centura, a cheap character for just 50 points this one. She can buff Sisters of Silence a little bit, but really again her main role is doing those same things. Get those psychic debuffs going on from just behind the Custodes battle line, and she's a bit harder to take out than the standard Sisters of Silence, as she can have character protection so she can't be directly shot. She can perhaps chip in with a little bit of damage with the Flamer or the Great Blade perhaps, and you could think about taking that Cancel Obsec trait on her so that Custodian troops plus her around would make for a very safe objective. Otherwise, for the rest of them, I just very rarely have seen people take them in competitive lists. I'd say perhaps the next most interesting are perhaps the Witch Seekers with their AP-1 flamers. Seeing as they're only 2 points more than the Prosecutors, it does mean that you can get a pretty reasonable damage upgrade for those 10 points. I still don't think that they're super standout on the damage front, but you can't deny that they're going to be a lot more threatening than the standard Prosecutors. So if you were taking a unit of them and you had 10 points left over and you didn't need them to be troops, then upgrading to Witch Seekers seems okay. They do also get a pre-game move as well. Otherwise, for Vigilators, they're basically melee sisters with the Great Blades. I feel like they're perhaps a little bit harder to use as they need to be in combat to make that extra value worth it, and they're not really all that hard to take out in return. You're probably going to lose some just to incidental light infantry attacks. Not awful, but Custodians don't exactly struggle for mid-strength damage 2 attacks. Otherwise, Alea I think is just nowhere near good enough for the extra 25 points over the standard Knight Centura, and their dedicated Rhino transport is maybe okay for the Vigilators or Witch Seekers if you want to make them work, but it does perhaps get in the way of the main reason for taking the Sisters, because once they're in the Rhino they can't be providing that psychic debuff or the stratagem. Overall, quite a lot of Custodes lists just tend to pass up Sisters of Silence entirely. I think it's fairly reasonable maybe to take 1 or 2 units of Prosecutors or Knight Centuras if you have the slots, and they're particularly good pickups if you're pretty sure that you're going to be going into a psychic heavy meta. Otherwise, if no one's running Psychers, you're probably just best off with more big chunky Custodians. Before we look at a strong list, I thought we'd just talk about the allies for the Custodes, and while generally in Nephilim, unrestricted allies are just a bit of a bad idea, cancelling out your faction unique secondaries and martial Catars, there are quite a few options that Custodes can reasonably take that don't do that. A single Inquisitor could be an interesting pickup. There's quite a lot of datasheets for them, and they all do slightly different things. You can either have a bit more melee power, extra deny the Witch with Greyfax, or just keep them cheap and take a stock 60-point one. Perhaps one of the biggest advantages of taking a one along is allowing you to do that psychic interrogation secondary, and gives you another pretty reasonable option in a lot of matchups. That would be the main driver to take them. They also can deny the Witch a bit as well, which could be particularly nice with Anathema Psychana units, though occasionally it might get in your way a little bit, as it would stop you taking that Abhor the Witch secondary to take out psychic units, say if you're playing Thousand Suns. Another interesting choice for allies would be an allied detachment of Imperial Knight Freeblades. It'd cost you 3 command points to have a super heavy auxiliary, but it does seem at least a fair few Custodes lists are taking these along. I guess as they go, they are one of the armies that's not desperate to spend loads of CP pre-game, particularly if you have a battalion with Trajan Valoris. Realistically, the efficient choices are likely to be either the Armiger Helverins or Warglaves. The big knights just tend to be a little bit inefficient if you're not layering them up with Relics, Warlord Traits, or Exalted Court upgrades. The Armigers really can add quite a lot of good stuff though. The Helverins are really nice gun platforms, fast-moving little walkers with Obsec and decent durability stratagems, and put out a bunch of Strength 7 AP-2 Damage 3 shots. You could maybe give them that Hunters of Beasts martial tradition and have them hitting monsters and vehicles on 2s. As it goes, I think they're a really reasonable alternative fire support option to Caladius tanks, perhaps doing much the same thing but on a durable Obsec platform. Otherwise, Armiger Warglaves would be the other option. They bring you fast-moving, hard-hitting melee and a bit of melter fire support. Maybe 2 of the better martial traditions could be the Noble Combatants one for the very big melee boost. That one's really quite nice if you're not using sweep mode, or the Strike and Shield one perhaps for a bit more toughness in melee and having them hold down midfield objectives just that bit better. If you do want a bit of knightly support, then these seem quite viable right now. Finally, for other agents of the Imperium, you could maybe consider the 50-point Voidsman at Arms. Technically speaking, if you just wanted the cheapest infantry squad that you could get in the army, then these are it. Not terrible if you just want something that's very tiny to hold down a home field objective, and they do come with a rotor cannon for a little bit of damage. Realistically though, I think that these do have stiff competition in Codex from the Prosecutors. They've got better armour, so are a bit tougher, and all the psychic denial shenanigans I think are generally worth paying the extra 10 points for, rather than just literally paying as little as possible. There are other options, but I consider these 3 perhaps the most interesting, particularly the Imperial Knights and Inquisitors. Finally, to round things off, I thought we'd just take a look at one strong Custodes army list. I had a look at a fair few, and I feel like this one is maybe one of the best examples of just showcasing Custodes strong stuff. It was run by a Clay Stubblefield, who used it to take 4th at Power 9 Games GT. The list is a single Emperor's Chosen battalion, and basically looks like a really well-rounded Custodes force, just taking a little bit of some of the strongest stuff. For the HQ slots, we've got Trajan Valoris, who's the Warlord, quite an easy choice with massive melee, good buffs, and pretty decent survivability too, plus some good Warlord traits for command points in Nephilim. Then there's a shield captain on Dawn Eagle jet bike with a salvo launcher. He's got the superior creation for a 5+ feel no pain, and it's also stacked with radiant mantle as well, a -1 to hit too. They take tip of the spear for reroll 1s to hit and wounds. Very fast, very deadly, and very tough. In the troops choices, there's 2 units of Custodian Guard. Interestingly, these ones have got 2 shields and 1 spear. I guess they'd be particularly sturdy to shift if you can get a bit of light cover on the shields there, even if you're sacrificing a little bit of strength on their main combat weapon. There's a unit of 5 prosecutors, a cheap expendable unit for the army, can do actions or hold down home field objectives or take a more prominent role against psychers. And then there's a rather hefty contingent of bikes and vehicles, 2 units of 3 Virtus Praetors with the salvo launchers, 6 big anti-tank shots there, and very good with the Emperor's Chosen rerolls. I'd probably be aiming to have them jump from cover to cover, popping off a few shots, and then charge something key. In the backfield, there'll be 2 hovering Caladius tanks. They take the Iliastus accelerator cannons. Good movement to get line of sight on outlying units, and generalist firepower that should always be pretty threatening to most units they target. The fast movement can help out with objectives in a pinch as well. Finally, and rounding off the list, are a couple of big stompy Contemptor Dreadnoughts, one Contemptor Achilles with the Stormbolters, that takes Eternal Penitent, enormous great big Guardian Spear with D3+3 damage there, always good to get an extra attack, and then a more hardy and sturdy Contemptor Galatus with the Warblade, pretty good into elite infantry, and even harder to take out and cheaper. Overall, I think it feels like a really nice balanced list for the Custodes. A bit of firepower, some stompy troops and dreadnoughts to take the midfield, and some fast-moving bikes led by a Dawn Eagle captain that could potentially rush one area of the board. Overall seems like a really cool list, a little bit of all the good stuff without overcommitting to any one theme like mass infantry or spamming dreadnoughts or anything. So with all that said and done, there's a fairly extensive overview of the Adeptus Custodes in Warhammer 40k. I hope you found at least some of it useful. As always, if you think that I've missed or glossed over anything, or there's some really important combos that I should have mentioned in the video, please let us know down in the comments. I always appreciate any other guidance myself, and it might help out other players. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular videos coming. I do tend to post new 40k stuff just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that one down in the video description if you're interested. Making big long videos like this does take an awful lot of time and effort, so if you are enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.